Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today we're going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one is called Estrogen Receptors. What do they explain? And we'll get into that, of course. And so a little bit of a different format here. This is a newsletter that he released, and as usual, you can find it on his website in the articles section. But again, a little bit of a different format because this is how his newsletters were sent out when he was sending those out. So typically you had to pay for them, and he had like an annual fee that you would pay, and then you would get one like every quarter or so. But anyway, this is one that he released for free, so I'm excited to get into this. All right, before we get into the article, I just want to remind you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your friends and family and others that you know could benefit from Dr. Peat's research and what he shared with us. I also have several links in the description, the main one being my website, MissouriHealthCoach.com. So if you're needing help along your health journey, I'm more than happy to come alongside you. You know yourself best, but if you need a little help, then I would love to be able to help you with that. And you can set up a free 15-minute consultation right there on my website. You also have access to a couple of links to different companies that I purchase from to buy things like aspirin and vitamin K2 and things along this line that Dr. Peat recommended. So if you use my affiliate links, then I'm able to earn a little bit of money from this. And so a lot of people have asked how they can support me, and that is an easy way alongside utilizing MissouriHealthCoach.com. All right, this is how it goes. In the last couple of years, hundreds of people have asked me about estrogen receptors. What does it mean that a tumor has or doesn't have estrogen receptors? What does progesterone do to estrogen receptors? What do weak estrogens or phytoestrogens, and phyto just means plant, that's the Latin prefix, what do phytoestrogens do to the estrogen receptors? We hear about, the different types of breast, C word, and, whether it's estrogen positive or they'll even call it progesterone positive. What does this mean, right? Okay. There are two main situations in which physicians are telling people about quote-unquote estrogen receptors. Tumor cells are said to be estrogen receptor negative or estrogen receptor positive, usually based on the reaction of artificially prepared antibodies with samples of the tissue. It is considered a good sign when the cells are quote-unquote receptor positive, because that means they resemble normal tissue. Some physicians also talk about the estrogen receptors in a more generalized way, in relation to their dietary recommendations or in relation to the use of supplementary estrogen or progesterone. And we have, I believe, what would be a little excerpt here. So I'm going to read what's in the box. We passed it there for a second, but I'm going to go back to it. In engineering, a quote-unquote transducer is a device for transmitting energy from one system to another, converting it appropriately, for example, turning pressure into electrical voltage, or turning an electrical signal into a light signal. In biology, the word is often used to describe the problem of understanding how sensory nerves are able to convert, for example, a photon of light into a nervous impulse in the retina or optic nerve. We are always, quote-unquote, transducing our environment into experience. Our experience is, quote-unquote, transduced into anatomy, structural responses that occur with learning and development. Okay, moving on. In the case of the laboratory results that show a tumor to be, quote-unquote, estrogen receptor positive, it is important to remember that the presence of this type of protein is a normal tissue property. Even the normal eye's retina is quote-unquote estrogen receptor positive. Breast tissues, including tumors, also normally contain quote-unquote receptors for vitamin A, thyroid hormone, progesterone, oxytocin, which is a pituitary hormone, and for a great number of other hormones and growth-regulating factors. The absence of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor is just one indication that the tissue is abnormal. Better clues to the cancerous nature of a breast tumor might be found in the presence of the quote-unquote heat shock proteins, or even the quote-unquote prostate-specific antigen, rather than in the quote-unquote estrogen receptor. But the protein, or rather group of proteins, called the quote-unquote estrogen receptor, has been of interest to oncologists partly because of the fact that estrogen is involved in the development of cancer, and because estrogens and anti-estrogens have been used to treat breast cancers. And I'm going to run back up here to read this other excerpt, and it goes like this. If a city is being evacuated, its railroad transportation system will be quickly, quote-unquote, saturated. And the impatience of 1 million people waiting for a ride won't make much difference. But if they decide to leave on foot, by bicycle, boat, or balloon, in all directions, they can leave as soon as they want to. Any number of people can leave at approximately the same time. A quote-unquote specific system is quote-unquote saturable. A quote-unquote non-specific system is not saturable. The idea of a cellular quote-unquote receptor is essentially that of a quote-unquote specific transport and/or response system. Specific transporters or receptors have been proposed for almost everything in biology for very interesting ideological reasons. And the result has been that the nonspecific processes are ignored or suppressed. Mistaken ideas about cholesterol, vitamin C, adrenaline, sodium, light, estrogen, etc. have been promulgated and accepted, becoming standard textbook doctrine because of these ideological commitments. All right. It's a good analogy there, or simile at least. Let me scroll back down here. As long as it is recognized that its presence or absence in a tumor is just one indication of the tissue's normality or abnormality, using it to characterize a tumor needn't cause any problems. But some people are using the term or the concept in potentially dangerous ways. So it is very important to see what is going on, and whether the quote-unquote estrogen receptor is anything people should be talking about. Tamoxifen, in quote-unquote anti-estrogen, competes with ordinary estrogens for binding sites on the quote-unquote estrogen receptor, though it has other actions, and its value in protecting breast tissue against estrogen's effects is recognized. However, it causes uterine cancer and is also toxic to the liver and other tissues. The drug companies would like to have drugs that oppose estrogen's C-causing effects. C word, right? Without the toxicity of tamoxifen. The drug companies are creating a culture in which the special properties of the quote-unquote estrogen receptors are to be the defining features for the special properties of the new quote-unquote designer estrogens and anti-estrogens. The quote-unquote selective estrogen receptor modulators, or SERMs, which will allow the new drugs to be approved solely on the basis of their effects on the estrogen receptors, which apparently are clear and simple molecular interactions without reference to their actual effects on the health of patients. This is closely analogous to the present situation in which estrogen is claimed to prevent heart disease on the basis of its effects on certain quote-unquote markers of heart disease. The substitution of quote-unquote markers for the realities of sickness and therapeutic outcome has been one of the drug industry's cleverest achievements. It allows them to sell quote-unquote HIV antiviral drugs for people who aren't sick and who might not even have the virus, on the basis that they or their mother have antibodies which could indicate that they have been exposed to the virus. The claim will be made that the newer SERMs, for example, raloxifene, are better than tamoxifen because they don't activate the estrogen receptors in the uterus. and so shouldn't cause uterine cancer, as tamoxifen does. This will allow them to be sold to patients who are told they need estrogen, as well as to the patients who will be told that they need an anti-estrogen. If the drugs aren't tested properly, it might be generations before all the side effects are discovered. And their damage to public health could be greater than all of the pharmaceutical debacles that have already occurred. In the 1950s and 1960s, the ability of bacteria to adapt to changes in their food supply was explained in terms of a simplified feedback system. In bacteria, specific proteins were found to regulate genes in response to the type of food available. But even in that simple organism, that theoretical model is inadequate and misleading. The favorite gene of the people who insisted on the orthodox regulator model actually undergoes adaptive mutation, which was exactly what their model was supposed to explain away. And there is the study there. This oversimplified idea was taken as a model for explaining how complex organisms respond to hormones such as estrogen. It was the prestige of molecular biology and the quote-unquote classical simplicity of the genetic model that made the idea persist, even when there were many reasons for believing that it was entirely inappropriate as a model for mammalian or human physiology. Okay, so far, we're starting to understand the idea of how when they associate things with other things, right? Here's this quote-unquote estrogen receptor, and we know that the estrogen molecule interacts with this receptor. So instead of looking at the actual physiological response of the human body to these molecules, all they need to say is that it interacts with this receptor, and then they can kind of sweep everything else under the rug, is what it seems like he's getting at, right? So it creates just this one-to-one relationship, and this is how most of, the medical establishment is. You have a cardiologist, right? You've got the OBGYN. You've got your neurologists, and you have all of these different doctors for this compartmentalized idea of the body and of medicine. And so it's very easy to be disconnected if everything is compartmentalized. And so, we see that across the board with the medical establishment, and with how they have, a drug for each, quote-unquote cure. And, we see the results of that, and it's pretty disheartening. But, as usual, I'm sure Dr. Peat will have some clarity, and he will bring it all together in a holistic approach. Because, right, we are holistic. Nothing is disconnected here. All right, moving on. The idea of the estrogen receptor has been around for 40 years, but it's only in the last few years that the candidate protein has been studied with real clarity. For its first 15 or 20 years, the status of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor was just hypothetical, philosophical, and that mystique is even more powerful now, adding a quasi-religious significance to the few facts that have been produced. And this is in bold. For that reason, we can't understand the full meaning of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor until we know why so many people were so sure that it quote-unquote existed. In the 18th century, varieties of Platonism, the philosophies that make up rationalism, were popular among the Tories, because the doctrine allowed them to believe that they were endowed at birth with innate knowledge of what is true and good, and that things were always going to be essentially as they were, without the need for special effort by them. John Locke proposed that people are born without any knowledge, a philosophy of experience or empiricism, and so everyone, through effort and opportunity, can learn. Political upstarts, including the American colonists, preferred this idea because it indicated that change is possible. Already in the 18th century, people like Erasmus Darwin were suggesting that nature progressed, learning even to make new species, while the conservative opposition held that although some species might have become extinct, new species could never appear. Lamarck, Buffon, and Erasmus Darwin believed that organisms learned from experience and through experience, adapted themselves to their changing environment, but the orthodox biologists held that the identities of plants and animals were inherited and unchanging. Nature had to fit the Tory rationalist philosophy. After the American and French revolutions, scientists in the different countries often found it convenient to compromise between absolutely rigid rationalism and excessively flexible empiricism, and they found a rationale in some of the ideas of Kant, who had made sort of a fusion of rationalism and empiricism, admitting that we do learn through our senses, but that what we learn in that way is superficial, that we can never know the quote-unquote things in themselves. About the things in themselves we can guess, and our guesses will be limited by our own rational limits. The Neo-Kantians came to see the correspondence between our quote-unquote inner rational nature and the quote-unquote unknowable things in themselves, in terms of mathematical forms. We could work out the possible mathematical forms in our minds, and then, through the little peepholes of our senses, we could do experiments to check whether the things in themselves were obeying one mathematical law or another. Karl Popper's writings in the 20th century clearly expressed this philosophy about science. Evidence in this view functions only to disprove theories which aren't true. In this way, mathematical rationalism has made only small concessions to the Lockean, referring to John Locke, democratic philosophy that things are new, open, and flexible. Several other mental habits have been attached to the Neo-Kantian mainstream of science, such as the deep assumption of the ultimate randomness of nature, and the preference for the simplest mechanical models of how nature works, because simple mechanical models are the easiest to relate to the mathematical description of their behavior, their quote-unquote laws. This philosophical context is given special power to an idea of quote-unquote one-to-one correspondence. All right, this is what I was kind of trying to get at. And to a related idea of an all-or-nothing response. Its overtones are everything. It implies exactness, completeness, perfection. One stimulus produces one nervous discharge, for example, and nothing else. If you set your apparatus up in such a way that it can't measure anything else, and if you define a quote-unquote stimulus as something which produces a nervous discharge, the quote-unquote one-to-one idea helps to sustain the mechanical models which make the mathematical hypotheses easier to manage. In genetics, one quote-unquote gene corresponds to one quote-unquote trait, because the system was defined in that way, not because organisms were usually constituted in that way. Traits like nerve reactions had to be all or nothing. The offspring of a red-flowered plant and a white-flowered plant weren't allowed to be pink because a discrete mechanical theory didn't want to recognize such confusing things. In sensory physiology, a unit of stimulus, for example a photon of light, was quote-unquote transduced into a unit of response by some object in the cell which changed one form of energy into another. The quote-unquote one-to-one correspondence idea, working in terms of a discrete transducer in the cell, led our scientific establishment during almost the entire 20th century to say that it was impossible, in principle, for radio waves, ordinary sound waves, red light, or sub-threshold X-rays to have any quote-unquote biological effects at all. The gigantic amount of stupidity involved in this can probably be taken as a hint that there is a fundamental flaw in our scientific, philosophical culture. It was these contexts in genetics and nerve physiology particularly that led to the confidence that there would be a quote-unquote discrete, or simple mechanical thing in certain cells, which would allow the quote-unquote female hormone to produce its effect, the quote-unquote female response. Passing quietly over the questions of whether estrogen is the quote-unquote female hormone and whether there is a discrete female response to be elicited by estrogen, we can think about the meaning of the existence of a protein in the cell, which is the receptor and transducer of the molecular signal of the hormone. If there are many copies of the quote-unquote female gene to be activated, and if there are many copies of the receptor molecule, then the response to estrogen can be graded from small to maximum, according to whether there are only a few molecules of estrogen reaching the cell, or enough molecules to quote-unquote saturated all the quote-unquote female genes, with the appropriate number of estrogen-activated receptor molecules. When the dose of estrogen is high enough to saturate all of the estrogen-responsive genes, or all of the estrogen receptor molecules, higher doses of the hormone will have no more effect. Okay, so we can kind of see how he's leading us here in an understanding of, what do these estrogen receptors mean, right? If it is as simple as here's the number of receptors, well, doesn't matter how many, molecules or how much estrogen I put in someone, it can only have the effect of saturating or interacting with those specific receptors, right? If you inject someone with more than what they can quote-unquote handle, then it wouldn't have any further effect, right? So I don't think that would probably be the case. We'll see what Dr. Peat says. For years, some researchers were finding exactly what they had predicted. Before estrogen was applied to the cell, all of the quote-unquote receptors were found in the cytoplasm, none in the nucleus. When estrogen was applied, the receptor bound the estrogen and changed its shape and was then transported into the nucleus, leaving none in the cytoplasm. After a time, the receptor and the estrogen that was bound to it activated certain genes which began transcribing specific RNA, which then moved to the cytoplasm, where it was used to produce the proteins which embodied the quote-unquote estrogen response. But as more people studied the system, none of those events stayed as simple as the early studies had indicated. Especially studied at the normal body temperature, the quote-unquote receptors appeared to be in a fully activated state without estrogen. Some of them disappeared at body temperature. Different techniques produced different results, and the receptors were probably already distributed throughout the cell whether estrogen was added to the system. When the system was held at nearly the freezing temperature, the added estrogen had the anticipated action. Although some of the experimental results are hard to relate to the supposed biological actions of the receptors, the alteration of these proteins by estrogen in a cold system is interesting in itself, since it indicates that estrogen changes the stability of the proteins when the watery solution is close to its freezing point, something which might be applicable to many other proteins, and which could have important implications for the way estrogen acts. The quote-unquote cold-sensitive receptors, like certain enzymes and structural proteins, apparently respond sensitively in the entropy of their watery environment, which suggests that they could participate in a cooperative holistic regulatory system. In the 1960s, endocrine physiologists were already pointing out that many different things bound estrogen, that some of those things responded instantly in the presence of estrogen, and that estrogen began producing its biological effects instantly when it entered the cell, and many cellular and organismic effects of estrogen were continuously graded from the smallest dose to the largest doses with no evidence of quote-unquote saturability. Okay, so seemingly not able to saturate. Meaning, if we go back to the analogy or the simile that he gave us where people are evacuating a city and there is a single way to evacuate, the train system, right? Saturable. But then if everyone was able to take different modes, right? If there were different paths, then seemingly it would not be saturable. And that seems to be what they're seeing here. Okay, this next sentence is in bold. If Popper's philosophy of science really represented how science works, the massive evidence that conflicted with the quote-unquote estrogen receptor theory would have disproved that theory. But the practical way to deal with evidence that doesn't measure up to the model is to ignore it. Which is what tends to happen, right? Sweep it under the rug. A few researchers, mainly people who study nerves and believe that nerves were governed by their quote-unquote membrane functions, noticed the evidence for estrogen's instantaneous effects and began describing these as estrogen's quote-unquote membrane effects. But these people, too, generally thought in terms of discrete and saturable quote-unquote membrane estrogen receptors. Another sentence in bold. The same model of cellular action by discrete quote-unquote response elements that led so many people to deny the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation has served the medical pharmaceutical establishment's desire to maintain that they understand and can control estrogen's potential for harm. Estrogen was said to be able to promote, but not to initiate, cancer, and to do that only in the quote-unquote female organs, uterus and breasts, which contained the estrogen receptors. All right. The abstract quote-unquote classical estrogen receptor model is a rationale behind the tens of millions of unnecessary hysterectomies that have been performed in the United States, and it is part of the argument for removing breasts to prevent cancer. And in bold we have, and for ignoring the multitude of other harmful effects that estrogen can have. Large doses of estrogen were said to be harmless because the response system was saturable, and beyond a certain dose, additional estrogen could have no effect. And then we have quite a bit here in bold. According to the idea that estrogen acts only through its quote-unquote receptor, it shouldn't change the activity of existing enzymes or immediately increase the cell's affinity for water, all right, edema, or modify ionic balances, or act on mitochondria, our entire metabolism, or cause mutations, or produce massive amounts of free radicals, or accelerate cellular aging, or cause an unsaturable, dose-related increase in active electrons as measured by their reaction with an indicator dye, or cause inflammation or epileptic seizures, or produce birth effects, or affect the stress/shock proteins such as the quote-unquote heat shock proteins, or disrupt microtubules, or disorganize the mitotic apparatus in a dose-related manner, up to the point that it produces genomic instability, three-cornered cell division, loss or gain of chromosomes, multipolar cell divisions, and finally cellular disintegration. Whew, and that's the end of the bold section there. That's a lot. A little bit pointed, if I do say so. None of those effects is predicted by the idea of the receptor transducer of femininity. And so the quote-unquote female hormone shouldn't produce them. If a physiological level of estrogen produces, in a dose-related manner, functional and anatomical changes in many parts of many kinds of cells, in many organs, in both men and women, independently of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor, then a thoroughly different approach to understanding the sensitivity and response to estrogen is needed. Many different tissues contain the protein that is called the quote-unquote estrogen receptor. Liver, kidney, thymus, pancreas, stomach, bowel, brain, retina, lung, skin, gums, etc. So, ignoring the responses which don't require the protein, the original intent of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor theory, has become pretty muddled. Unless it can, for example, explain that there is something sexually relevant in a woman's gums. And men's tissues have the quote-unquote estrogen receptors just as widely distributed So the quote-unquote specific response idea has become so difficult to sustain that it is slowly coming to be held that the estrogen receptor does something different in different tissues and under different circumstances. But at that point, the silliness of calling it the quote-unquote estrogen receptor should start to become apparent. It would seem to be just one more of the many things which respond to estrogen. Estrogen produces many effects without the quote-unquote receptor. And when the receptor is quote-unquote activated, what it does, wherever it is, still hasn't been satisfactorily defined. Rather than pretending that estrogen's many effects just don't exist, a few people have looked for ways to find order and generality in the complex diversity. Szent-Györgyi's career was devoted to finding some integrating simplicities that would make it possible to understand the quote-unquote living state, which he saw as a special state of matter which corresponded to certain ways of using energy. For most of his career, a central question was how this special state of water in the cell helped to sustain certain active electronic states. At one point, he studied the ways in which estrogen and progesterone oppositely affected the physiology of the heart. He obviously wasn't treating them as quote-unquote female hormones. Influenced by Szent-Györgyi in 1971 and 1972, I proposed that estrogen, by influencing the cell's water structure in a particular way, could in an organized way alter the function of a large number of enzymes and physiological processes. The change of water structure induced by estrogen is analogous to quote-unquote melting. In this type of change, a loosening of the structure of the water can be seen to occur in a variety of other cellular states. For example, in the big C word, aging and lack of oxygen. Articles by Troschen, Cope, Damadian, Wiggins, Clegg, Drost-Hansen, and Ling discuss the issue of the difference of cell water from ordinary bulk water. And I have an article out there, and I'm trying to remember the specific one that goes deep into the difference there between cell water and ordinary bulk water. But it's one of his longer ones, I believe, and I just did it recently. So, going back to the old ideas of radical empiricism, it was the whole animal, or the whole cell, which experienced. Experience wasn't reduced to sensory atoms, which activated inner structures one unit at a time. Sensory atomism was given a strong foothold in science when Einstein proposed the quantum interpretation of the photoelectric effect. That theory was conditioned by the same philosophical environment. Theories of the quote-unquote living state represent attempts to bring empirical reality back into science, examining what happens in reality rather than what can be found that corresponds to the convenient units of our favorite way of calculating. In its long history, the theory of the estrogen receptor hasn't produced any demonstrable benefits, except to the drug industry. Tamoxifen, useful for its anti-estrogen effect, is active even without the estrogen receptor. Even the idea of using the estrogen receptor idea in cancer prognosis has proven to be little more than a fantasy. But the idea has produced a great amount of harm, allowing the drug experts to assure the public that they understand where estrogen's risks and benefits lie, just as the X-ray experts used to assure the public that low doses of radiation couldn't cause the big C word, or brain damage, or birth defects. When someone speaks quote-unquote knowledgeably about quote-unquote estrogen receptors, it is important to ask just what they mean, and what evidence supports their claims. Language matters. The doctrine of the quote-unquote female hormone acting through its quote-unquote receptor is being used to sell drugs. They say estrogen delays aging, and if one estrogen causes the big C word, they will provide a designer estrogen or a specific anti-estrogen to prevent or cure the big C word. Okay, language matters. Whew, isn't that? That one hits hard because, I mean, anytime you're having a debate or a discussion, you could be using the same words, and the other side or the other person could mean something totally different. So we have to define what these things mean. So don't just jump into a conversation without defining your terms, as they say. Okay, moving on. Ordinary estrogens are being promoted to prevent osteoporosis, heart disease, and, though they don't yet make direct product claims in this case, Alzheimer's disease and other degenerative brain diseases. If estrogen is protective against these diseases, why is the incidence of osteoporosis and Alzheimer's disease so much higher in women than in men? And why is the incidence of bone fractures caused by osteoporosis increasing, even among men who are now being exposed to more estrogen than in the past? For a long time, estrogen was sold to quote-unquote prevent miscarriages, despite the clear evidence that it caused them. The language of deceitful salesmanship made that possible, since the quote-unquote female hormone had to support the quote-unquote female function of childbearing. When the industry realized that it would eventually be able to sell the product to prevent childbearing, it invented a ridiculous rationale, claiming that taking estrogen acted to lower estrogen and prevent conception. I'm not surprised. Not to mention, and I'm sure I'll bring this up, but a lot of these quote-unquote progesterone birth control pills are actually progestins, which are not progesterone at all, in the slightest. But the side effects of having too much estrogen forced them to lower the dose of estrogen, and this was occurring at the same time that the estrogen pill was supposed to be lowering the body's estrogen level. Essentially, the industry will say anything that the public will swallow, and the public will swallow a lot. When patents on one generation of drugs expire, the industry prepares the public for a new generation of better drugs by quote-unquote educating them in the new uses of the language. The language and ideology of the quote-unquote estrogen receptor is like the patter of a prestidigitator. And I had to look that one up. And that basically is someone who does magic tricks to amuse someone. But moving on. Distracting the audience from the real issue. Is the drug going to be helpful or harmful? Right? And that's the real issue. Is it actually helpful or harmful? If we are free of the receptor dogma, we can think of controlling estrogen's effects by means other than by making molecules to block estrogen's binding to its receptor, or making molecules to bind to a quote-unquote anti-estrogen receptor. This next paragraph is in bold, and it says, "It is now clear that estrogen is intimately related to the universal stress reaction system, the heat shock proteins. Progesterone, the most direct and general antagonist to estrogen, is now seen to be involved in this fundamental system. It opposes the actions of the stress proteins, and the stress proteins mediate the factors which cause a progesterone deficiency. The problem of allowing estrogen to have its useful effects without causing cumulative harm, such as aging the brain and bringing on menopause, is essentially a problem of achieving optimal functioning without stress. The problem has to do with the organism in its environment, not with specific quote-unquote designer drugs." And as usual, you can see all of his references at the bottom of this newsletter. But man, that really brings a lot of clarity to how this whole estrogen receptor dogma, I guess we can call it, has influenced the way we view female health, the way we view just estrogen, and you can see how these are all interconnected. You know, this quote-unquote one-to-one relationship that the medical establishment tries to push, very successfully, because people want to be able to take that silver bullet, right? But there's a reason that there's a meme of take this to fix your, blood pressure, and then you got to take this to fix your depression that's caused by that. Then you got to take this to fix, the big C word that caused, and it's a bit of a downward spiral, to say the least. I hope you enjoyed that article. don't forget to like the videos, subscribe to the channel, share this with people that need to hear this, and seeing the number of people that are coming up with the big C word these days, it is a lot, because most likely after a quote-unquote diagnosis, they are pretty much being shot in the foot, as it were. I'm sure they're being prescribed things that are not exactly helping. Okay, until next time, guys, God bless.